Okay, great. So, as I mentioned, welcome everybody to our Raw Compliance webinar today. These webinars are actually, the topics and the discussions for these webinars are actually generated by you, by the members, by people within the community, and really the key topics that we're looking at the moment. So today's webinar is going to focus on sanctions, and I think one thing is pretty clear. In the past few years, there has been so much movement, and actually in particular the past few months, so much movement in the sanction regimes. And the question really is compliance still manageable, if I can speak today? Can we stay on top of it? Does our technology support it? Are we getting the right data streams? And importantly as well, from a training perspective, how are we supporting our compliance staff to make sure that they're aware of the changes and that they have the necessary knowledge to be able to advise on the changes in sanctions? So on that note, we have three incredible speakers with us today, and we're very, very lucky. First and foremost, we have Kelvin To from HSBC Singapore, who is Head of Sanctions and Transaction Monitoring. Kelvin is a highly respected compliance officer within sanctions and transaction monitoring, not just within Singapore, but within Asia Pacific. So if Kelvin, if you don't mind, possibly I could ask you just to quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks for the compliments, Una. My name is Calvin. I'm the head of sanctions for HSBC Singapore, and more recently, also the head of transaction monitoring. I started my career actually with the Singapore regulator, the MAS. So I was there for a couple of years. As a guy that liked to read newspapers and generally keep up to date with current affairs, I was so happy when I found work that actually relates to what I like to do and where I can apply what I like to do in a work context and do some analysis. So I stepped into the world of sanctions, starting with a Singapore bank. And yeah, I've been on this journey ever since. That's been more than 10 years. So very happy to be on this panel today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelvin. So you're telling us to be a good sanctions compliance officer, we just need to have the ability to read newspapers. So that's not, honestly, thank you so much. And as Kelvin mentioned, he is an ex-regulator, so we're very, very lucky to have him today. And then secondly, we are very, very lucky to have Pekka Dare with us from ICA. Pekka is a seasoned sanctions specialist, trains multiple banks globally on in particular sanctions. And so again, Pekka, if you don't mind, could I ask you just to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Una. Yeah, delighted to be here. So I'm a director of stakeholder and delivery excellence at the ICA. So I work all around the world with pretty much most tier one institutions. We train a lot of regulators actually as well in the sanctions space. I'm an ex-money laundering reporting officer and head of financial crime at various institutions. And just really, to echo Calvin's thoughts, I would say sanctions is, I find, probably the most interesting and challenging area of compliance, and it's so tied up with geopolitics, isn't it? And that change is, I'm sure, one of the challenges that's going to come out today is the pace of that change, isn't it? So yeah, no, thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining us. And then last but certainly not least, please welcome to Nasir from Pelican AI. Nasir is actually head of product for financial crime compliance. And then Nasir, if you don't mind, could you introduce yourself, and also importantly, please tell us just a little bit about what you guys do over at Pelican.
Definitely, thank you, Una. So as you said, I'm heading the product team of financial crime compliance within Pelican, and I've been doing the strategy and for financial crime compliance within technology for the past years. Now in Pelican, we're doing the same. Basically, Pelican provides the market with solutions that are AI powered to combat money laundering, combat terrorist financing, as well as AI solutions that help in payments. And because of this interrelationship between payments and compliance, the company has been working during the past 25 years on introducing those intelligent solutions to help the financial industry to make sure that they remain in compliance, but also do it in a very efficient manner, fast compliance, but also fast payments. So that's what we basically do.
Thank you very much. And I think that's one thing we're definitely going to address today is pace, is the speed at which we're actually being able to clear and look at sanctions at the moment, given the large volumes and the importance that the role of technology plays in that also. So really looking forward to the discussion ahead. As mentioned earlier, just for anybody that missed it, this is an interactive session. This is not one of these stagnant presentations where we just talk. We would like you to ask any questions in the chat room which you would like us to discuss. In addition to that, there will be some polling questions so we can actually talk about the polling results, and we'll also bring some statistics in from some industry studies that have been done as well. But this session is for you, so please again ask any questions. So without further ado, you'll hopefully all see the slides in front of yourselves. What we're going to be looking at today, as mentioned, is kind of some key, I suppose 6, 7 key areas. What is the reality of the recent sanction changes, not just in terms of the changes themselves, but the impact on our ability to service our clients in the most efficient and effective way? Is it slowing down business? And what does that actually mean for our day-to-day operations? How quickly, again, Decca talked about geopolitics earlier, how quickly are we able to adapt to changing geopolitical environments? Again, interestingly, we'll be looking at the convergence into economic and social governance policies, and how sanctions policies and ESG requirements do actually go hand in hand in many institutions and should go hand in hand so we can stay abreast of geopolitical changes. We'll be looking at the risk of more complex legal requirements. Again, additional compliance challenges, whether technology is going to be able to help us, and again, the future cost and the complexity. At the moment, this is a big resourcing challenge, but are there ways in which we can reduce the cost of resourcing in a more effective and efficient way? So on that note, again, we're going to be looking at the recent changes. Whilst we talk, we're going to have some polling questions which will pop up, so feel free to just answer those as we go along. And the first one, I suppose, is really around scale, and what is going to be the average number of sanction lists? Again, sorry, so many things have popped up on my screen. How many sanction lists on average do you think each bank employs on a daily basis just for payments alone? So please feel free to answer the question, and again, we'll come back to this as we go through the first section. So slide 1, obviously we're looking at the regimes. There have been significant changes in not just recent years, but recent months, especially, again, we've seen from the US government, both economic and trade sanctions coming through. And also as well, we're going to start to see significant movement on the UK side. As we know, obviously Brexit, the formal Brexit kind of leave date in terms of, in UK becoming fully independent from the European Union actually happens at the end of this year. And what does that mean for UK sanctions when they're going to be out on their own? Will they be using them in the same way the US has been using them in recent months and years? Or will the UK take a different stance? So just on that note, again, we have a slide here on the United States. Again, Pek, I know that this is something you speak to on a daily basis, but maybe we could just ask you to talk a little bit just about the United States and the sanction developments we've been seeing.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously you can see that the figures speak for themselves, really, that whatever you think of Trump, he's used sanctions as his primary political tool, hasn't he? Like no president before him, dwarfs what Obama did, doesn't it? So, and we've seen, of course, the backed up by the huge range of legislation that's come on board as well, ranging from CATSA to RINSCA to all these lovely acronyms that we've seen over the years, and the growing complexity of it all as well, targeting particularly the SSI regimes that we've seen in Russia and Venezuela. And we're going to talk about the complexities that's imposed on firms, just understanding payment terms and invoices now, and the date that a customer has to pay an invoice, if they happen to be linked to one of these sectoral sanctions targets, could render it a breach of the SSI regime. So I guess it's the sheer volume of sanctions being imposed, and it's the complexities just changed beyond all recognition, hasn't it? And we know as well that the application of the US nexus as well continues to grow. And we've seen, I think we have a slide on it later, we've now seen the first applications of claiming a US nexus over transactions due to use of US infrastructure, which I think in the case we're going to show relates to the use of a server that happened to be in the US. And that was pretty much the only connection to the US. And of course, we've seen the growing use of secondary sanctions as well. even if there isn't a US nexus per se, it's that good old power of the US dollar and the ability of the US to threaten locking out of the US financial system that causes, you know, I guess firms to tread very, very carefully. Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if the rest of the guys want to add anything to that, Calvin or Nasser, you want to add anything to the US sort of focus and how it's changed in the last few years?
I think absolutely right. I recall for the Venezuelan program, at one point in time we had, I think, 35 general licenses that the firms have to analyze each of them to really make sense of what is allowable and not allowable under the regulations. And for each of the licenses, there are also multiple iterations along the way. So you could have a 5A and then subsequently a 5B. So it just speaks of the complexity that sanctions compliance officers have to grapple today to comply with US sanctions. And in terms of the speed of change, I would particularly recall the incident of the Turkish ministries being sanctioned, where the designations were turned off after, I think, about a week plus or so time frame. So there is a tendency for sanctions to be used more like a light switch, and it adds complexity to firms on how we set our strategies to comply.
And that was actually one question I had for you, Kelvin. Again, a question has come into the chat room as well. I think one of the biggest complexities around the US is obviously a number of issues. You know, as Pekka mentioned, primary and secondary sanctions, the 50% rule, and obviously the definition of a US person. And Benny in the chat room has said, you know, facilitation and extraterritorial elements make US sanctions quite complex. From a practitioner perspective, you know, is this becoming a daily issue that you're having to look at? Or are you starting to get to grasps a bit better with these various issues?
I think it's a journey over time. So, for example, if we talk about the 50% rule, initially when it came to the industry, it did raise a lot of concerns. But over time, because we also had vendors in the market that adapt to the needs of the industry. So there are intel providers that will provide services to actually do the mapping back end on entities that are owned 50% or more by SDNs, and then these services become purchasable by financial institutions to use.
Yeah.
And yeah, in terms of the point about facilitation and secondary sanctions, definitely, and I used to recall for secondary sanctions, it used to be mainly just a Iranian program issue, but we have seen that obviously expand a lot over recent years. So yeah, it does entail a reconsideration of strategies you need to undertake, and some firms are actually thinking of how they can ring fence the risk, especially as we do in more situations where at times we also face conflicts in terms of the sanctions that we need to comply with.
Thanks.
I would just add one thing in there, Rune, and maybe that might be one for NASA as well, is just on, I've seen a few cases with the 50% rule, for example, where firms have had to, you know, not just be aware of the changing general licenses around, say, Venezuela and the Venezuelan ownership of an entity, but there was a company operating in Europe, which was owned by the Venezuelan government, and it was subject to a general license, but then the ownership actually changed. So that majority ownership of the Venezuelan entity stopped. So not only do you have to be aware of the changing sanctions regimes, obviously there's that massive link to your CDD and your understanding of your client's beneficial ownership, keeping up to date with those changes in beneficial ownership as well. So I guess it's having the links between your sanctions policy and your CDD being joined up as well. And I guess that's it. You know, the complexities of that, making sure it's all connected, NASA must be a massive challenge when you're dealing with firms, I guess.
Definitely, that's a very valid point, Becca, and that's why and we're going to see that in the coming slides about, is it one size fits all? Is it easy to deal with them? Are the regulatory requirements that change from a geography to another the same. How to deal with the data is difficulty. And that's why we say that those conventional solutions are no longer valid or capable of handling these changes. The solutions need to be integrated with each other. You need to have those CDD measures and those sanction screening measures, whether when you're onboarding a customer, when you're doing your continuous due diligence, or even when you're doing your transaction payments, continuously working intelligently, making sure that they can handle those increasing sizes of lists, but also the continuous changes on a daily basis. The vendors, the data vendors, are also facing this difficulty because the changes happen very frequently, and regulators are expecting you to stop things immediately at the moment that the change happens. So a more frequent data update needs to happen. You need to have the technology that's able to do that. The information needs to serve multiple functions, multiple areas within compliance, as you mentioned. The CDD department, the people who are handling the CDD, the continuous due diligence, and the account opening, but also the transaction screening to make sure that you're covering it. The change in the regulations, the 50% rule, or else even when you're talking about UBOs and the percentages of that define if the person is an ultimate beneficial owner, also is changing very rapidly, and you need to take this into consideration. And this is also a technological challenge for financial institutions and for the software development.
And can I ask you, Nasir, on technical perspective, obviously updating beneficial ownership and knowledge about changes in client is quite a manual process. It's not something we would be able to derive from a database per se for a privately owned entity. So obviously speaking with clients, and totally, going back to the point of integration, we need our systems to be integrated. But have you seen any ways in which clients that you have dealt with have been able to overcome what is a manual process in many instances to be better informed about changes to their client structures and not relying solely on periodic review timeframes to do that?
Well, yes. So it is definitely a challenge, and you definitely have a manual process sometimes to depend on what your customers tells you, specifically when we're talking about corporates. But there are databases that are being created in the market that enable a better handling of your customer due diligence on your onboarding process, where you integrate with those databases that continuously update their data, exactly like data providers of sanctions lists, for instance. And an integration with those databases can always help in doing it. But you also need to remember that it's a risk-based approach. So you need to make sure that on a frequent basis, when you have high-risk customers, high-risk QBOs, that you will need to do the due diligence more frequently. The manual part will always be there. It is practically impossible at this point to eliminate in full, but depending solely on a manual approach will definitely cost a lot, and technology is starting to get adapted to that.
And that's a really important point as well, you mentioned about awareness, and it's something that is one of the reasons why Raw Compliance is established, is about increasing awareness. When you've spoken to clients, you talk about relevant databases. How aware have clients been about the databases that are available to them to access this information?
Well, I'd say some are more aware. In many cases, certain financial institutions would tell you, I want this specific vendor, or I want to deal with this specific vendors, and others would ask you for your recommendation based on the expertise and working with multiple financial institutions before. But when it comes to ultimate beneficial owners, I think they are not sufficiently aware of those databases that are available as much as they are aware of the databases for sanctions. They're starting to get, for example, more aware of the need for dual use goods databases when it comes to trade sanctions screening. But for UBOs, it's still not sufficiently known. We're trying to raise awareness on that as well, because that helps them a lot.
And Kelvin, from your perspective, obviously from a day-to-day industry perspective, are you finding that the databases that you're using are evolving quick enough to be able to keep on top of the changes that you're seeing happening in the market?
Actually, I would say it's a ongoing cat and mouse game that we are playing, especially if we go beyond list matching, right? If we talk about how do we detect potential evasion, what the sanctions evaders are trying to do. Increasingly, their typologies are getting more complex, so we do need to move our controls accordingly to cater to the risk. While screening will always be a fundamental control, we also need to think about how we actually analyze the transactions and activity of our customers, and what we understand are patterns that may be indicative of potential evasion, which traditionally fits into AML transaction monitoring type of discipline that not many sanctions compliance professionals are actually equipped with today to speak on what are the controls that needs to be in place.
Absolutely. And it was a really interesting note from a UK perspective, when we were putting together the presentation for today, and we're looking at statistics year on year. And for the period, 2019 to 2020, in the OFSI annual report, they mentioned about the fact in this past period, there's been 140 in past year, 140 voluntary disclosures of potential sanction violations by banks. And that is actually up from last year, which was 99 institutions did voluntary disclosures. So I think what this begins to show you is that there is a real concern here that, the organizations themselves aren't able to keep abreast of the changes as and when they're happening, because they are so fluid, and they're happening at such a high pace. And as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of complexities, primary, secondary, 50% rule, beneficial ownership changes, etc., that are coming through. So that's kind of on the UK. Pekka, I know obviously you're based in the UK. Is there anything specifically with regards to Brexit?
Just I think part of this as well, I can remember a few years ago actually training a brand new intake of off-sea officers, and they were serving police officers from the UK, and they were great guys, but they knew absolutely nothing about the practical implications of running sanctions in a large regulated firm. And that was about 4 years ago. And since then, they've obviously invested a lot more in technical knowledge of their own people, and they started out with very softly approach. We're not here to be the new OFAC. We're here to be your friend and give you advice. And of course, now they've got the powers, and any regulator, if it doesn't use its powers, will face criticism. So I think it's a combination of growing complexity, firms having to divulge more, but also the regulator starting to flex its muscles, starting to resource up as well. And it's interesting to see, and I know most of our viewers are outside of the UK, but it is an interesting regulator to keep an eye on, because obviously regulators all work with each other in terms of their approach and share common practices. So, for many of you will have seen the Standard Chartered enforcement case, so that's a good one. But I would just say go and have a look at the OFSI website. There's lots of interesting guidance and thoughts on there as well if you've not had a chance to. And just finally, I guess on Brexit, most commentators are saying with Brexit that the UK is perhaps going to move to a more US-style approach to sanctions, and certainly Russia seems to be the big one. The view is that the UK has been historically more hawkish on Russia, so perhaps we'll see the EU soften its position on Russia. And you look at the countries that suffer economically from the tit-for-tat sanctions with Russia, it's your Poland's, Norway's. And whereas the UK, I think, is seen to be a bit more bullish on that. So who knows, though, is the short answer. We live in a very complex area, but interesting times. But I would say, just a piece of advice, go and have a look at the OFSI website if you've never done so.
Yeah.
And we're going to see more, absolutely, of course, we're going to see, I think, that trend of enforcement from the UK sanctions agency continue to go north for sure.
Absolutely, and I think it's definitely going to be an area that we're going to have to keep a very close eye on as it evolves going into 2021. What was interesting this year, obviously there has been a real crackdown in terms of Russian money laundering in the UK, which, I think it's fair to say, and it's no secret that it was a kind of known unknown, or even a known known for many years that this was happening. But obviously the crackdown has happened, and again, there's a lot of geopolitical angles that are coming into play here. Obviously, large international corporations, again like HSBC, the impact of all of these regime change, presidential changes, Brexit, etc. How are you, from a staff training perspective, keeping on top of these types of changes, Calvin? It must be incredibly challenging.
Yeah, actually it does, and in a way we cannot also train the staff based on what we preempt to happen, based on what we expect of the regime changes. So what the approach we take is, I think we try to be more proactive in terms of scenario planning, anticipating what may happen. But we can't keep this in our pocket. So it's more from the perspective of having a tool that you can use and then not scrambling at the time when the actual changes happens. And training, all that will then take place accordingly based on what we have earlier planned for and what is the policy that we are going to employ depending on what's the scenario that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nasir, on that point as well, obviously, one of the things that I think is very obvious within sanctions regimes is where it's an incredibly reactive area of compliance. But obviously, from a technology perspective, you know, what Kelvin mentioned there was about scenario planning and anticipation. From a technology perspective, how easy is that for you to anticipate changes? And again, the time frame for implementation of those changes also.
Of course. So this varies depending on the type of changes. So, and it varies as well based on how you've built your technology at the beginning, anticipating, thinking of the fact that this regime, this environment, this regulatory environment is extremely complex and is subject to continuous changes. So in certain cases, things are not easy to do, and sometimes you will need to plan for these things. Banks also need to plan for the implementation and the testing. So if something is happening by end of 2021, we need to think of it from today or maybe even yesterday so that we could have it ready, tested from our side, presented to our customers, them taking sometimes, it depends on the size of the bank. Some take 2 months, 3 months testing, some take 6 months testing. And if they find something, you will need to work on it. So yes, it needs to be anticipated much earlier. This being said, there are things that help. If your solution is built in an agile way, in a configurable way, if it is enabling high configurability, there are many changes that could happen on a day-to-day basis that can easily be handled through the configuration. Yeah. But in principle, the major regulatory requirements, they need to be planned for and thought of much earlier. And that's why regulators sometimes give you 2 or 3 years until they put something in execution.
And I love what you mentioned there as well about kind of emerging risks. And if I may compliment HSBC, Calvin, it's something you guys do incredibly well, you know, talking about top risks and emerging risks. So, you know, as Nasir was saying, they're anticipating changes. And, you know, if there are changes happening in 2021 that we know that are coming through, we should already be working on those changes. And again, Calvin, I know that that's something proactively that you guys do incredibly well through your various committees. Maybe you could give some guidance on that note to people in the call today. How can people within, from a sanctions perspective, get better awareness about being, let's say, being more proactive to sanction changes? Where should they be looking? What types of information or data should they be keeping an eye on? As you mentioned earlier, you know, you like to read newspapers. Is that where people should be focusing? Again, it'd be great to get any insights from a practitioner perspective.
Okay. I think we can break it down into 2 parts. So the first is on estimating or preparing for regulatory change. So for that, I think actually some of the nuances you can pick up from the media for first-hand information, because ultimately they are linked to some foreign policy of the governments that impose the sanctions. And a lot of times there will be some prior drum beating by the politicians at the media side on certain foreign adversaries that they want to focus on, some of the actions that they plan to do. So that can form some of your information for scenario planning. The second part I would say is anticipating risk. So it's not on regulatory change, but potentially what are some of the customers that may be of a concern.
Yeah.
So for that, you actually need to go into activities of your customers, anticipate based on patterns that you observe. Are they likely to be a concern in the future? Will they likely be sanctioned by the regulators? And for that, I think technology also plays a part. So there are things that banks are doing today to improve their detection of risk, for example, by doing network link analysis on their customers. So you don't just look at the relationship on a silo basis, do your KYC and annual review just on that customer, but instead you are extending it to activity that is in your whole customer pool for you to detect unknown risks that you have to proactively manage to better deal with your sanctions exposure.
If I could add to that, Kelvin, I think, again, with the risk of flattering HSBC, I think you guys do a lot of great work on encouraging critical thinking in your staff around sanctions exposure in the first line. The relationship manager, who owns the relationship, when they're doing their reviews, they need to be critically thinking, right, what's changing in terms of the jurisdictional footprint of my client? Who are the counterparties? What's the supply chains? What's the intended future direction of travel? If they have some indirect exposure to a sanctioned jurisdiction, strategically, where are they looking to take that in the next 3, 4, 5 years? And of course, that looking at your customers change all ties in with the geopolitics. If there's talk of expanding further into Iran, for example, and obviously we need to take a view as a corporate where we're going longer term with Iran and how comfortable we are with indirect exposure and what level of indirect exposure we can live with as a company. And just one thing for me on a linked topic about this is the importance of escalation. So again, HSBC are brilliant at that. Really clearly defined escalation points when sanctions exposure is identified. I think that's probably so key. So, you own a relationship, you realize your client has potentially even some form of sanctions exposure. I think getting the formalities of escalation in place so they work, whether that's approving a customer's exposure or a transactions exposure, or whether it's taking it right up to some sort of reputational risk committee, all of that governance around escalation and the awareness of when to do that I think is one of the best ways you can manage sanctions risk. And there's a lot of technology which helps with this as well. Like if you're a global corporate like HSBC, you need one view of the client, I guess at a master group level, for example, around the world. And obviously the systems that you have to help you do that, and everything from how an RM does a activity review of transactions and counterparties, the technology now is getting very good at giving relationship managers one toolkit so they can look at that and say, aha, I see the sanctions exposure for my client is changing. And then I know I need to escalate here. But without all that technology and governance, the danger is you're going to miss that stuff. And I think that's going to be the challenge for a lot of the firms on the call today. How do you get those escalation points in? How do you get the technology, to help us with that as well?
And I think go ahead, here.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on your question from the beginning. There's one problem that we might face as sanctions specialists on a day-to-day is that we sink in those day-to-day operations and we forget to look more strategically, as Pekka mentioned, and to make sure that you do that, you need to give some time. You cannot go and sink only in day-to-day operations and forget about the strategic aspect and all those changes. So you mentioned that, like you said at the beginning, Pekka reads newspapers. Compliance is a community. It's a global community, and you need to be part of this global community that has multiple stakeholders, a regulator, your fellow compliance officers, the institutions that regulate, but also that give best practices. You need to be part of it, and you need to give at least a daily or a weekly time to interact with them, to understand what's going on, to see what's going in the market, and make sure that you plan to it strategically from the day 2 or 3 years before, so that you can make sure that when time comes with a specific deadline, that you are already ready and you are already there.
Yeah, and it was one interesting, while you're talking about all of these things that, let's be honest, we need a lot of foresight in terms of our clients' strategy for investment. The sanctions could impact their investment profile, the products they're invested in as well, a business continuity planning in that regard. But importantly here, again, Pekka, something very close to you, skill sets. There is a wide range of skill sets needed here in order to get this right. And, again, one of the things I've seen a few clients speak to me about is, intertwined compliance and ESG programs. Again, having the foresight in potentially geopolitical changes and sectoral changes. So Pekka, from your perspective, how can we get that skill sets and those skill sets that are necessary within our teams? Because we're asking for a lot of diversity here.
Yeah, so I think actually and you don't often hear this talked about in the same breath, but I think soft skills and sanction skills are actually very closely intertwined. So, assimilating large amounts of data, focusing on the critically important aspects, and, working with colleagues as well. So, in a complex financial institution, there will be, different people involved. You might have different country level relationship managers, different country level sanctions teams, and it's about, seeking advice and working collaboratively with your colleagues as well. But I think coming back to that point about critical thinking, so, being curious about your customers and really understanding it to the point that I think both Kelvin and Nasser made, understanding the not just their business, but their counterparty's business as well, and the direction of travel, their strategic objectives. Another key challenge, I think, as well, is understanding their control frameworks. Yeah. So Kelvin mentioned ring fencing, and I think Nasser did as well. So, if you have got direct exposure to a sanctioned country and a client, you obviously need to get comfortable that part of their business is not touching your institution. So how do you do that? And that's where you're going to have to work with the person that owns the relationship with that customer, plus your sanctions subject matter experts to get comfortable that you have got proper ring fencing so that those funds aren't touching your business. And how do you actually successfully manage that risk? So yeah, I think critical thinking is probably the main skill. And the last thing from me on it is I think training is so important, and it's not generic sanctions training. I think that's got its place, but it's really scenario-based training for those who are in these roles, high-risk roles. So it's to say, look, let's give you some scenarios. Let's walk through the skills you're going to need here. How could I identify that I have sanctions exposure in a client? And if that happens, what do I actually need to do? Yeah. And I think that scenario-based training is what we're seeing with all of our key clients now. It's moving away from kind of generic sanctions training into more skills-based training, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and what's interesting just on that scenario is that Kelvin made that point earlier, about the fact that kind of trying to proactively preempt what's going to happen. They, at HSBC, they do scenario planning. And so again, we need the scenario training in order for people to correctly do scenario planning itself. And again, interestingly as well, and again, Pekka, if I may go to you first on this kind of key sanction issues. Again, I know Nasir mentioned earlier about clients becoming more aware about dual use goods awareness, supply chains, direct and indirect exposure. Could you give us maybe some, Pekka, first and foremost, from your perspective, how management of these high risk areas is actually practically happening, and again, the challenges within that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you take direct and indirect exposure, which we've talked about a little bit, again, a lot of your controls here are driven by really understanding your client and governance around that process. So, for example, formal questionnaires of clients, which will capture, hopefully, the true extent of any sanctions exposure. And obviously that's tied up with monitoring and IT solutions. So you're looking to see actual transactions if they're hitting the right areas. So, but I think a lot of it is about the relationship owners and the risk owners for client relationships really taking the time to properly assess the sanctions risk. So it's, again, I would encourage everyone on this call to ask the question, how comfortable are we with the sanctions risk assessment elements of our CDD process? Do we think it's really capturing any sanctions exposure? And remember, the sanctions exposure just isn't about dealing with sanctioned individuals. It also relates to all the complex issues you've got on your screen there. So are they involved with dual use goods? Are they involved with potentially exporting goods subject to BIS US trade sanctions? So how are we capturing their supply chain exposure? And this is where you've got to have technology because it gets so complicated. But I think it starts with education and training for those that own the relationships, and then about building out the infrastructure. So you have your sanctions exposure questionnaires, and you have your escalation points for approvals if there is, sanctions exposure identified. And that's what the regulators want to see now. When the off-season OFACs and MASs of this world come in and look at you, they're going to say, okay, where is the training on this? Where is the governance? Where are the escalation points? And the link is to CDD. And of course, as you've got on your screen now, what's fascinating, I think I saw some figures, I don't know if anyone else in the call knows this, but the growth of sanctions, actually the biggest growth area isn't on banks or regulated financial services firms. It's on non-financial services firms. And you can see Elf Cosmetics there, good example. I don't know if you're all familiar with this case, where they actually, their supply chain audit found they had North Korean fake eyelash kits coming in, which they thought were from China. And I believe they self-disclosed it, but they still got a penalty. So, you know, the reputational risk and the challenges is not just for regulated firms, but it's for any commercial firm, isn't it? And, you know, the challenge of doing all that due diligence is so key. Yeah, so again, it just points to the complexity, really.
And one of the questions coming through in the chat room, we've had lots of questions and discussion points coming through. One of the ones from Faisal was obviously on their previous slide, we talked about politically sensitive. Could you maybe give some examples of countries where we do see political sensitivities? Are China and Russia deemed to be politically sensitive, and if so, why?
Sorry, was that to me?
That was to you, sorry.
Yeah, do you want to go back to the last slide if you could, just to whether we mentioned that phrase? I don't know I just want to make sure I get the right context. I think obviously, you know, listen, we all know, no, don't worry, Una, that's fine, don't worry. I mean, we all know that sanctions are driven by a range of agendas, aren't they, globally? And you know, I often train in the Middle East, and I often get people coming up to me saying, Becca, who are the Americans to tell us what to do? As if I'm some sort of instrument of US foreign policy. You know, and what I always say is, look, you know, it doesn't matter what you think of US foreign policy. You know, if you choose to not follow US sanctions regimes, there are big risks, big financial risks, big, you know, big legal risks, you know, and so it's about going into these complex areas of political agendas with your eyes open on the risks and consequences, isn't it? And yeah, of course, you know, the vast majority now of new sanctions regimes in the last 4 or 5 years have all got a political agenda to them, haven't they, at some level? And you can't get away from that when you talk about sanctions. That's what makes it so interesting, isn't it, Kelvin and Nasser? You know, this is partly why we love it. Yes, it is very sensitive, and obviously this is where you get the clash of civilizations, don't you, in different jurisdictions. And you know, I mean, I travel to Russia quite a lot, and it's very interesting to talk to Russians about their view of sanctions coming in from the US and the EU, and you know, so of course I think you've just got to accept that is the reality of sanctions. A lot of it has got a political dimension. It doesn't change the risks for your firms, though, does it? No, regardless of where your politics are and what your worldview is. And
on the other hand, you will have the US telling you that it's their sovereign right to choose who they want to do business with.
Yeah.
So
it's a fair point.
We all know that who could survive if you're a financial institution without access to the US dollar? That's a reality on the ground.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's why you get these challenges with the EU trying to enforce the blocking statute with Iran or Cuba versus firms saying, well, who are we perhaps more concerned about getting in trouble with, the Americans and losing the US dollar access, or the EU? And that's why you see European banks voting with their feet when it comes to Iran, don't you? You know.
But the one positive thing I see about this increased enforcement on the non-financial sector is that it also builds the risk awareness of our clients. So when we do the client outreach, when we do our CDP, because of these incidents, it actually makes it easier for our business to communicate to the clients that
are you seeing that,
we do need to do.
Are you seeing that a lot? Are you when you reach out to clients, they actually seem to be more aware now themselves, do they?
Yes, and it actually helps in us explaining to them our objectives of finding out the information from them, because it is also to protect them from falling afoul of the regulations. And I think particularly for
one of the great things about sanctions, isn't it, Kelvin? You can have open conversations with customers and clients, can't you? Because you're not in the tipping off world of money laundering, are you? And you can. There's an element of education here, isn't there, where you can say, look, you know, this is our bank's policy. And if you wish to continue to work with us, we want to work with you. Here's what we're going to have to do. If not, you may need to choose another bank, you know, and you can have those kind of grown up discussions, I guess. Yeah.
And one of the questions, again, you know, we talked a lot about the complexities here, and obviously understanding and identifying, you know, the changes within client profiles. And again, Nasir, one of my concerns is the fact that many of the systems that we have today are too static, so to speak, in terms of being able to look at complexities, and we do need to move towards an environment of AI and machine learning, which is all well and good. But one of the biggest challenges that we have is our big data problems. Our data is fragmented, our data is siloed, we don't have a lot of system integration. And again, technology plays a massive role in us being able to proactively identify the issues. What are you seeing when you speak to clients around this? Where do they start? Because this isn't obviously a problem that we can fix overnight. And to fix big data challenges, again, is something in many institutions, depending on the size, could even take a couple of years. So how do we slowly begin to implement those technology changes and enhancements?
Yeah, well, they don't start. They just put all the problem in front of you and they say, this is where we are. Data is siloed. We don't have any integrated solutions and we need a solution. I want 1, 2, 3, find a solution for that. And that's very normal. That's understandable because the change that has happened, I mean, AI has been just a topic that was talked about 4 or 5 years ago, and it hasn't been implemented and executed heavily, specifically in compliance, but very recently. And people have seen it implemented more in AML transaction monitoring rather than sanctions because of the sensitivity of the decision. But we've reached to a point where we cannot continue without intelligent solutions that are capable of, as you said, you need machine learning. You need to understand and learn from previous decisions so that you can make appropriate decisions afterwards. And that's correct. But there's a problem that most of the data, whether in payments or even in trade, is just data, not labeled, not structured, not clear. And so that's the beauty of AI. AI depends on multiple different technologies, multiple different items that can help in dealing with different situations. Yeah. So you would find the machine learning that will deal with structured and labeled data, but you will need to utilize something related to data mining and natural language processing to understand this free text and structure it before you start the learning process. Or you could go and depend on machine learning with unstructured data and just utilize it, for example, for grouping your customers, clustering the customers. So it is true that it's a big difficulty. It differs from a bank to another. There are banks who have huge data. There are banks who have limited data. There are banks who have huge data but structured. There are people who might have very limited data but just not properly cleansed. You start with data cleansing prior to starting with executing or processing the data. The only thing that is clear is that with this size of data, whether coming from payments, from onboarding customers, or from the regulators, by the increase of the size of the sanctions list, but also other kinds of watch lists, because we've tackled client onboarding. So thinking of PEPs, thinking of adverse media, thinking of dual use goods for trade. You need solutions that are capable and scalable, but also intelligent enough to deal with every circumstance or every situation with the right technology that can solve it. So it is not a one size fits all, one solution fits all, but technology companies now are starting to understand we need to integrate and we need multiple different technologies that support ourselves, support our solutions to be able to support the different cases of our customers.
And one of the points that you made there, Nasir, I think it's critical. It's something we don't talk enough about, is linguistic capabilities of our systems. And a lot of the small fintechs that we've seen coming through, at Raw, we speak to a lot of fintechs that are coming through, and looking at how we can reduce false positives within sanction outputs. And the focus on linguistics has been phenomenal. And maybe you could talk as well about the importance of having these linguistic tools to reduce your false positives.
Sure. And that's a very important thing because people are talking a lot about NLP's natural language processing, but it's not really available sufficiently in the market. Just take a simple example. Bagdadstrasse is basically a street that is called Baghdad Street in Berlin, in Germany. If you screen the message, the system will automatically stop it because there's the word Baghdad, and the system will think that this payment is going to Baghdad, the city, while in reality, this is not. This is just the name of the street. So you will need a system that is more intelligent to handle this and to tell you clearly that this is a false positive. How do you do that? The system will need to understand, first of all, the context in which the payment is happening. So it would understand the fact that Baghdadstrasse is basically a street name, not a city name. Specifically that you have the name Berlin, which is a city afterwards. But also the system needs to depend on knowledge-based systems, systems that have built over the period of time knowledge and understanding that Strasse is basically the German word of rue in French or calle in Spanish or shara in Arabic or whatever it is. You need knowledge to build this intelligence, and you need very complex algorithms that are capable of understanding the context, analyzing the context in which payments are so that you can stop them, or even in customer due diligence and onboarding. So it's definitely a very critical point at this stage.
Thank you so much for that. And again, jumping to a very different point, but obviously a very important point, a lot of the enforcement action that we've seen in recent months has focused not on frameworks, but actually focused on culture. And again, Kelvin, if I may kind of, pick your brain on this a little bit from an industry perspective, culture, policy, the tie-in of the two, tone at the top, within specifically with regard to sanctions, is that something that you're beginning to talk about more? And what role do you feel like culture plays in getting the right tone for your policies around sanctions within your organizations?
I think culture is actually the most important part. If you talk about pillars for compliance framework, because it really underpins what your policy aims to address. Because you can have the best policies and controls, but there are always ways that internal staff and insiders, if they know the policies or thresholds well enough, they can game these controls. So culture really underpins whether your staff believes in the organizations are aimed to comply with the regulations and then do the right thing. And on that, I found the example quite interesting about the neuro-linguistic ability, because I think what we can look into tech, right? The way you set your policies and the right culture also plays a very important part. So I had instances before when I get escalations where the name is obviously a different name from the watch list. For example, it can be a 3-syllable name, and because of the way the system works, right, it goes by fuzzy matching. So you can have a Korean that matches a Chinese. So if you bring it to a human, on first sight we will know that it's a false match in terms of the name, but there are cases where it gets escalated to us the same. So when we ask the analyst why, they said because we have a zero tolerance for sanctions. So when you say zero tolerance, right, are you talking about zero risk appetite, zero room to apply risk-based judgment? That is certainly not the right way to set the culture as well, because you will end up in a situation where nobody wants to make a judgment call for fear of being punished if you make the wrong decision. And when we see in the AML world, regulators and the industry are talking about focusing on effectiveness and outcomes instead of taking a checklist approach. I think for the sanctions industry, these are similar conversations that we need to have.
It's really funny you mentioned that. I think sometimes the decision making around these issues is like a hot potato. Nobody wants to hold it and everybody's thrown it to everybody else to make the decision. And that's a cultural issue that really needs to change. It needs to be a collective decision that's made and agreed. But as you mentioned, people have become so risk adverse and so scared of making and taking the wrong decision that nobody wants that accountability either. And again, Pekka, I'm sure that you see this quite a lot within your training as well, people asking questions about ownership of decision making and risk appetites.
Yeah, all the time, and I think it emphasises the point that actually sanctions is often about grey areas of risk tolerance and risk appetite as well. It's not always just black and white, is it? So yeah, just to echo all the points that have been made, really, you can have all the sanctions policies and procedures in the world, but if people don't care about them or don't believe in them, they're pointless. And that applies to any compliance, doesn't it? So, but I also agree, I think you can there's subtleties when we talk about culture, when this is where the training and education piece is so important. So people understand that it's not necessarily zero tolerance to sanctions breaches doesn't mean, you know, we can't take ownership of decisions, and being clear on who owns the risk assessment, I think, is really important as well. And that move of direction is very much at the first line, is responsible for assessing the risks of their relationships and taking ownership of understanding the sanctions risks and making and articulating an argument of why that sanctions risk is acceptable. Yeah. It's become a key skill now for the first line in banks in particular, where through some sort of documentation, they have to articulate how they've got comfortable with the sanctions risk exposure. And that kind of comes to the culture piece as well, because it's about taking ownership of the risk and saying, yes, there is a risk, but actually I've got comfortable with the risk because here are the controls we've got in place. Here is the level of the risk. And you know, that is a really empowering culture, but people need the right skills to take that ownership and articulate those decisions.
Yeah. And not having this,
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. And not doing that is very dangerous, actually. Not having this appropriate culture of risk is dangerous, because there's this head of compliance in one of the banks that I've heard saying compliance is and will always be good for business. So if you do not if you do not promote a culture of compliance as a partner with business, and instead you go and block everything just because of fear of risk, you will not be a partner with the business. And remember, business is your first line of defense. They are the ones who will be reviewing things prior to going to the compliance department. So if you're hindering them with those regulations, they will not be your partners. And if they're not your partners, they will not be doing a good job in protecting your bottom line.
Yeah, I got a couple of questions here privately in the chat room. One of them was, could we talk through how to execute a sanction risk assessment? I do apologize, we've only got a couple of minutes left. That definitely is not enough time, but if there's a call for it and a need for it, we're more than happy to do another webinar just on that, but we may need more than an hour. But interestingly, in a recent Deloitte study, it was across 388 FIs in the industry, and 70% of them said that they had actually in the last 2 years undertaken sanction risk assessments. And it's actually worrying that there's another 30% out there that haven't, or indeed don't understand it. And again, I'm conscious of time, and I hope that people on the call won't mind if we run over by a couple of minutes. But Kelvin, if you wouldn't mind just spending a couple of minutes on the importance of a good sanction risk assessment, because for me it's a fundamental importance to the success of your program.
Yeah, I think it should be considered as part of your enterprise-wide risk assessment. So besides doing it for money laundering and terrorism financing, you do have to look at it from a sanctions risk standpoint as well. So it's important because you need to be informed and you need to identify the risk before you can assess what's the efforts you need to manage and mitigate the risk. So in terms of some of the indicators involved, I can share a few examples here, but it's not exhaustive. You do need to look at typically your activity towards high-risk jurisdictions and sanctioned countries. You do need to look at your screening hits volumes, your true hit volumes, and all that. So think about what you are doing for your day-to-day controls and try to build some MI or indicators around those to inform of your annual assessment. That will be my suggestion.
Thank you for that. And one thing as well, just on the slide that we've got here, again, conscious of time, but again, Nasir, a kind of off-the-shelf solutions. There's a number of institutions, again, I've spoken to in recent months, who have kind of stepped back and are looking more greenfield on their solutions, kind of going back to basics to create something specific for their organization. Again, leveraging existing technology in the market, but making it more specific to their infrastructure, their risk appetite. Again, from your perspective, what are you seeing around that?
Well, I wouldn't judge and say there's no solutions that are fit for all, but what I would say clearly is due to time, when you're evaluating your solutions, see where your gaps are. And when you look for solutions for those gaps, think of two major things: how agile and configurable the solution is, and secondly, how intelligent it is. But let me add as well how scalable it is. So look for solutions that can protect your current investment, what you have already done as policies, what you've done as procedures, what you have in place, and see if you could add solutions on top of them, stuff that would work with them, that would not replace them, but rather complement them to cover what you need. If you need intelligence on top of your solution, look for something that has AI, that has NLP, that can not throw in a bin all what you've done during years, because what you've done during years is training, is culture, and that's something you also need to protect. So look for something agile and look for something intelligent.
And definitely two words I would throw in there is sustainability and evolving. So, you know, you need to have solutions that are sustainable, that will evolve with you, your risk appetite, and as the sanction environments change. So we're down to our last slide. Appreciate we've run over by a few minutes. You know, one of the things I think is quite clear from today's presentation is sanctions and management of sanctions. There is no simple solution. You need to have a very robust framework, a comprehensive framework, as Kelvin mentioned earlier, that has been strategically planned, that is proactive, not reactive. And again, we do need people to be trained. The importance of technology speaks for itself, and culture is there as well. So if you wouldn't mind, if I go around the tables, Kelvin, if you wouldn't mind just providing a few kind of final thoughts on sanction frameworks, and what do you think the key takeaways should be for people who've attended today's webinar?
I think the key takeaway will be the environment continues to be complex. We do need to be more strategic in the way we manage risk. So what we apply in terms of policies 5 years ago may not be used today. Sometimes we may need to take a wait and see approach and think about how we can ring fence risk while we wait for a clearer picture on the developments. So that will be my key message to end off.
Thank you, Kelvin. And Pekka, over to you.
Yeah, two things for me. I think the importance of looking again at the joined up approach between risk assessment, CDD, and sanctions, making sure that you're really comfortable, you're capturing and assessing your sanctions exposure in your clients. And the second thing is, you know, I would say this, wouldn't I, but it's so important to make sure the training you're giving your risk owners in your business is tailored and relevant to what they do, so that they're equipped to deal with this incredibly complex and fast changing world of sanctions. So again, I would say if you're giving people sort of generic sanctions training, you think again, you need to think about more skill-based, more scenario-based, more interactive, immersive stuff, because this stuff is complicated and people need the right tools to make the right decisions.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And Nasir, last but not least, over to you.
I'd say solutions are core for sanctions compliance. Just make sure those solutions are fit for your culture, your compliance culture, as well as all those changes that are happening rapidly on the market.
Wonderful. Well, on that note, again, appreciate we've ran over by about 5 minutes, but I think this webinar has been incredibly and phenomenally interesting, even from moderating this session. And this is an area that I know quite a bit about. I've even learnt from yourselves today. So thank you to you, Kelvin, to you, Pekka, and to you, Nasir, for all of your insights today. We really hope that this has been useful. If there is enough interest, again, I'm sure that we can run a webinar on how to do a sanctions risk assessment, or indeed, I'm sure that Pekka would be more than happy from an ICA perspective to help you out on that one. But the recording of today's session will be available on our website, www.rawcompliance.com. Any questions after this, please feel free to let us know. But on that note, firstly, to our speakers, thank you all so much for your time today. We really appreciate this. And secondly, to all of our attendees, thank you so much for your time today. And if there's anything more that we can do to help to support knowledge and experience development, or indeed any ideas that you have around innovation, please feel free to share them, and we can connect you with other people in the market to begin those conversations. So thank you everybody for your time today. And again, to Pekka for yesterday, a very happy birthday. And again, thank you all very much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks everyone. Take care.
Have a wonderful day. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.